This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. It's not only St Paul's Cathedral in London which has demonstrators at its gates. 1 mile or so to the west in Portland Place, another venerable institution has been under siege.
Because cut the bonuses at boardroom level, cut the celebrity rubbish, and give us local radio.
Protests outside Broadcasting House in support of BBC London and other local radio stations and against the planned cuts in their programmes and jobs. And do you need more news at lunchtime? You're going to get it.
I don't believe the controller of Radio 4 actually does what I do every weekday. I listen to Radio 4 from the early shipping forecast until the repeat of the Woman's Hour serial, or she would never have decided to extend World at One by 50%. I work from home, and by 6:30 in the evening, I've had 15 minutes of news briefing, 3 hours of Today, 30 minutes of World at One, 1 hour
Just one of a
PM,
number of feedback listeners who is not looking forward to the new afternoon lineup. But first we head north, to where the sun always shines, the blue sky is reflected in the crystal clear waters, and the rowers skim up and down the canals. I am, of course, talking about Salford, to where every London-based BBC producer and executive is desperate to move, and where this year's Radio Festival has just been held.
Radio Festival Radio.
This is Radio Festival Radio.
From the Radio Festival 2011 at the Lowry, Salford Quays.
The independently run festival is one of the biggest events in the broadcasting calendar, attracting 600 delegates and around 100 high-profile speakers, including Melvyn Bragg, Victoria Derbyshire, and the Director-General of the BBC, Mark Thompson himself. In fact, everyone who is anyone was there, darling, except for you, the listener. A bit of an oversight, I thought, so I took a couple of listeners along with me to let the movers and shakers know what the audience thinks. As you might have guessed, the future of local radio was high on the agenda. A few weeks ago, the BBC proposed that its local radio stations in England take what amounts to a 12% cut in their budgets and share more programmes between neighbouring stations. Alan Lynn thinks some of us are more equal than others in the BBC.
Having read about the cuts that are being threatened to Radio Cumbria, and then on the same day, hearing that Andrew Marr and his team were jollying off to Australia to broadcast the start of the week from Perth, I thought that the BBC had rather got its priorities wrong.
This is Philip Edwards from Northwich in Cheshire. Almost 44% of the BBC's entire budget is allocated to BBC One television. By comparison, the whole of BBC local radio receives just 4.6% of the total budget, and radio in its entirety just 19%.
John Phipps, also from Cumbria, has identified another area of the BBC where he thinks fat could be trimmed first. During a recent visit to the area by Radio 1's Chris Moyle's show, John said he was amazed by the size of the team which travelled with the breakfast show presenter. But back to the Radio Festival in Salford and a debate entitled The Death of Local, hosted by 5 Live's Sam Walker, and in which various speakers, including David Holdsworth, the controller of BBC English Regions, talked about the impact of the cuts. We got our hands on a feedback Access All Areas pass for BBC Radio Shropshire listener Andy Boddington and took him along.
I want to find out what's happened to local radio. I was rung yesterday by an 88-year-old listener in Shropshire who said she was totally bereft. And she said, go and tell them not to cut it and go and find out why they're cutting it. There's much more they could cut.
Well, I hope we'll find out why in a few minutes. Let's go in.
If you actually look at the sort of value per listener, in England, £2.83 per listener is what the value of local radio is. In Scotland, £7.37, Wales, £10.95, Northern Ireland, £11.93 per listener is the budget out there. How's that fair on the listeners to English local radio?
Well, there's a number of things going on. What we have, with the luxury of in England, is 40 separate stations, and I think that's something to be very proud of. I think it's a privilege to run.
Imagine we're here at the Radio Festival in 2021, and we're discussing BBC local radio. What sort of conversation do you think we're going to be having then?
I think BBC local radio will continue to thrive. Who else is going to spend a fortnight, 4 weeks, investigating gang culture in one town as a result of the riots? Who is going to have that kind of commitment? And I think that the answer to your question is there is a deficit.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions then from the floor? Yes, gentlemen here. Have we got a microphone?
Thank you. I'm Andy. I'm a listener from Shropshire. Radio Shropshire champions our county, but also cries with us when things go wrong, when people get sacked, when companies close. What you're doing is making it much more news-based, and by switching out to the regions, it breaks that critical continuity that we need.
So I feel very strongly about this. 1 in 3 people in Shropshire listen to that station on a weekly basis, and you're quite right, the companionship and the sense of family and being with the listeners.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
Well, Andy, that session was called The Death of Local. Are you convinced that local does have an afterlife, a continued life?
Yeah, it has a continued life, that local radio is still good and strong. But what we're hearing there was PR, people presenting their own pitches. Everyone is talking, no one's listening. One man did say, if you listen to the local listener and listen to your audience, local radio works. And that's possibly the only good message that came out of this session. And the idea that somehow that this money can be taken out, journalists we got rid of, backroom staff got rid of, and it'll all be fine and rosy is utter nonsense.
Well, let's see if we can put some of those questions directly in a rather quieter atmosphere to David Holdsworth. So, Andy, given the fact the cuts had to be made, what don't you like about them?
It's going to take quite a bit of the local out of local radio. Local radio is unique. The BBC's service is second to none in the world. It's really integrated into communities. When something bad happens in Shropshire, it runs from the morning through to the night. We're a small, close-knit county, and we need that tie-in.
So, David Holdsworth, what happens if there's a local story that's very important and running, and suddenly will you have to stop and go away from it and share programmes which will not be about it because it has to be relevant to other areas?
Well, I absolutely believe in the way we develop local community links with a station like Radio Shropshire, and it heartens me hugely to hear what you've got to say about our output, which I'm very proud of, because actually I happen to be a member of the team that launched that station more than 20 years ago. In our current proposals, between 6 in the morning and 7 at night, all output would still remain local, bar one programme. If ever, to answer your question, a significant story broke while that programme was on the air, we'd revert to local output straight away.
But you'll have, ultimately, 20% less staff to cover it.
Well, we'll find some of those savings by reducing the number of off-peak programmes we do at the weekends and in the evenings. But the main journalism function of the station and the peak time programmes will be largely untouched.
It's not just journalism. It is this community function. It is part of knitting the fabric of what we do in Shropshire together. Let me quote Jean Cole. She's 88 and she rang me yesterday. She lives in Shropshire. And she said, I was so upset. I felt so bereft. Radio Shropshire means such a lot to me. I wouldn't wish to see any of these presenters go. I really care about it a lot, and she's quite typical.
I am worried, obviously we'll be worried if any listeners in the end, whatever their age, feel they're not getting that special relationship which local radio can offer as a result of any changes that we make. And I would absolutely set us the threshold of continuing to offer that warm companionship wherever we're broadcasting from at any time of the day, because I know it's a crucial part of the local radio relationship.
Can I ask, do your colleagues in the BBC understand that? Because I get the impression that senior managers in the BBC don't listen to local radio. They think it's about news and music output, and they don't actually understand what it does.
Yes, what is absolutely understood is that BBC local radio binds communities together, delivers first-line journalism at the base of the whole of the BBC's news-gathering pyramid, and actually delivers an audience that elsewhere in the radio we find it quite hard to find.
But it's not regarded as highly as BBC One or Radio 4 or Children's, because they've been protected. You haven't.
Well, I think throughout this process, Mark Thompson and everybody else in the BBC have been very open about the fact that this is not going to be straight statistical salami slicing, that decisions are going to be made, and that decision's been made about Radio 4. The kind of savings the other radio networks are facing are very similar to those of local radio. The actual savings that are being asked of local radio are 12% of the total cost. The problem, and the reason perhaps there's been more controversy than you might expect with that figure, is that we found it particularly difficult to find savings in the overheads area because we still wish to maintain 40 high-quality buildings in which to house our radio services. So it translates that 12% into about 19%, which becomes a tougher target.
Helen Borden, who's director of BBC News, and I want to ask you whether you believe this, that she said BBC local radio can survive and even thrive under the cuts. Do you really believe that?
I think if we focus on what we do best and the programmes we do best and still continue to deliver that emotional relationship through our off-peak programmes, we can thrive. I do actually think that local radio can go on and grow from here in BBC terms. There is a deficit in this country in terms of the amount of local journalism provided by all media. I think BBC Local Radio can increasingly occupy that gap and become more famous for it.
Now, the Director General at the Radio Festival seemed to suggest there was some sort of review going on, and that John Myers, who's done an earlier report for the BBC Trust, was going to discuss with you whether there were other ways of implementing these cuts, but presumably you've been through everything.
Well, I'd like to think we know our books fairly well, but what I have done is I myself have been speaking to John Myers, and I'm in the process of commissioning him to do some work to help us with this task, because if we could, we'd find the maximum level of savings through efficiencies. And we'd always want to do that first before affecting the output. Now, John's got a wide experience of the radio industry. He might just be able to help us, which is why I'm going to commission him.
Now, specifically about this shared programming, there's been scepticism from some of our listeners, Tamsin Vincent, for example, who heard that you'd piloted these things, thought to be successful, widespread consultation, and she says, I never heard about this. In fact, I can't find anybody who was consulted. I mean, was there really widespread consultation about the shared programmes that were piloted?
No, what there was professional and proper audience research. We combined 3 stations in Yorkshire, and both in a statistical and focus group way, we asked the audience what they thought. And the way I would describe it is that quite a lot of the audience didn't notice the change. There was a minority, though, who were very resistant to the idea of less localness, and we're aware of that as we prepare these proposals. There's a limit with the audience to how much you can play around with the schedules. I absolutely accept that, because what makes local radio work is the word local, and you take that away and you're in trouble. I accept that, but I think the changes that we're currently proposing, given the scale of the licence fee challenge, are reasonable and won't damage that relationship.
Isn't there something strange here? There was a press release last week which said BBC Local Radio adds more than 250,000 listeners. Don't you feel rather hard done by? Here you are successful and you're being penalised.
I would want to absolutely just concentrate on getting the best out of the journalists that remain. We are actually going to invest in more political reporters as part of this entire process. An individual spends real time, sometimes a week, 2 weeks, on one story. Is there anybody else left in the local media world that can do that? I don't think so.
So, Andy, have you been reassured by what you've heard?
Not entirely, I'm sorry to say. That you're playing a good line, David, but we all know these cuts are going to hurt and they're going to damage local radio. I do wish you'd say that. I know your heart is in local radio, but I'm not convinced that that heart is heard well enough across the BBC.
If we're back round this table in 2 years' time and you feel that we have failed you in terms of the quality of the Radio Shropshire experience, I would certainly feel a sense of failure then, but I'm really positive that won't be the case.
Shropshire lads, David Holdsworth and Andy Boddington in Salford. Well, the BBC Trust is encouraging listeners to make their views known as part of the ongoing consultation into delivering quality first. But local radio listeners across the country are already making their voices heard in a rather different way, through direct action. John Kennedy is a big fan of BBC London. He's often heard on air defending his black cab-driving colleagues during late-night phone-ins. Last Friday, he was joined by more than 100 other BBC London listeners in a protest outside Broadcasting House here in London.
Cut the bonuses at boardroom level, cut the celebrity rubbish, and give us local radio. And say BBC London. Very simple, very easy.
My name's John Kennedy, Londoner, taxi cab driver, and an avid listener to BBC London and BBC Radio. I'm gutted, saddened that the Director General and the Board of Management have got to this position. It's important that a radio broadcaster understands London doesn't go to sleep.
BBC London 94.9, it's 10:05.
This is BBC London 94.9.
When Mark Thompson, David Holdsworth, the Board of Management are in bed, there are thousands upon thousands of people out here working, keeping this city moving. I work nights myself. I listen to The Late Show. I call in.
And to ask a question, John in Clapham. John, you're on to David.
I'll tell you what, I feel really insulted this morning. I'll tell you why, I'm a night worker.
If you take the night slot away and the late slots and the afternoon slots, I can tell you now people will switch off listening to local radio and they'll go to the commercial sector. Because once you lose a listener, you tend to find you lose them for not for a long time, you'll probably lose them for good.
My name is Herbert Crossman and I'm campaigning for BBC Radio London. Well, I'm wearing ball and chain and shackles to show that we're shackled to what I call the Director General and the hoppos that really don't listen to the people. We're the ones that pay the licence fees and they should be listening to what we're saying and what we're asking for.
I'm Mickey Crouch and the main reason I'm here tonight is because I spent 25 years as a mental health nurse. There's a lot of public service workers that stay awake grafting all night on very low wages that use Radio London as a comfort blanket to get them through the night. Mr Thompson, you're making a big mistake if you think you're going to take on a large group of vulnerable Londoners.
I'm Val and I'm here because they're cutting our radio station and I'm not having it. The shows are tailor-made. It's just nice to have something that is very specific to your area.
My name's Tony Cacavoni. I'm a licensed London cab driver and I'm a regular caller and listener to BBC Radio London. It's like a community, really. Lots of regulars that phone in and many people that listen in on the regulars that don't phone in. And we've, been very loyal to the BBC, and this is how they treat their regular supporters.
I'm Louisa, and this is my dog Daisy, and she's wearing a specially fashioned item that says "I heart barking at the moon."
Barking at the moon. Oh, barking at the moon. Woof, woof, barking at the moon.
And she loves barking at the moon. It's the only radio show devoted to dogs, and we listen every week.
Play for Matilda.
I've learned so much about London from the Robert Elms show, and if it goes, it would be a tremendous waste.
Go to the cuts. Go to the cuts of BBC London.
John Kennedy and friends making themselves heard loud and clear. And you can do the same by contacting me at Feedback. You can send a letter to Feedback, PO Box 67234, London SE1P 4AX, or leave me a message on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but some mobile networks might charge more. Or you can email feedback@bbc.co.uk. All those details are on our website. You can also follow us on Twitter. Now, time for an update on an astonishingly popular piece of music, among BBC producers anyway. The ever-vigilant Glass Watchers have been letting me know of any new sightings, or rather hearings, of Philip Glass's haunting facades theme. And my attempts to get the current number of hearings up from 7 to a nice round 10 seem to have encouraged some bending of the rules. Chaotic tweeted at BBC R4 Feedback to ask,
can we count the music in Feedback in the list of glass recycling programmes?
What do you think? No, that would be cheating.
My name's Coralie, and I just had to get in touch with Feedback. I don't care how many times you play it. That piece is the favourite of my favourite composer, and I'm glad to hear it as many times as possible.
Hello, my name's Roland Coombs. Currently in the Archers, they have the very controversial theme of Clive Horrobin, who's been released from prison, coming back to Ambridge. So I think the Archers should not miss out on this much enjoyed music, and perhaps they could play extracts every time Clive Horrobin is about to make an entrance. Go on, Feedback, give it a trial run.
Be here soon.
Yeah, he should be. Look, why don't you just go and play with your Lego till he comes?
Yeah.
Must be him.
Just stay calm. I'll answer it, OK?
Oh, hello, David. Tony, we thought we'd see your visitor safely to your door.
Hope you don't mind.
Not at all. I haven't had this much attention since I come out the nick.
Now for the scheduling earthquake, which is shaking the foundations of Radio 4. OK, I exaggerate. It's a tremor. We're moving to a later slot. If you listen to Feedback on Friday, then this time next week you'll hear instead The World at One, followed by Dr. Jeff Bunn talking about a history of the brain. The news programme is being extended to 45 minutes in length each weekday. and therefore there is only room for a 15-minute programme before the news at 2 p.m. It's all change, as the new afternoon schedule, as announced by the controller of Radio 4, Gwyneth Williams, some months ago, comes into effect. Whoops, there goes afternoon readings, says one poster on the Radio 4 blog. The campaign to get them all reinstated continues. Nearly 9,000 people have signed a petition calling for the reinstatement of all the short story slots on Radio 4. On Facebook, someone who calls him or herself DG is amongst many who say they will miss the variety of programmes and quizzes enjoyed until now at 1:30 p.m. But Gail Scott Wilson is happy about the extension of World at One on one condition.
I sincerely hope we are going to get more of Sean Lay. He is a most accomplished broadcaster, always calm, always polite, always in control, and with one of the most palatable, listenable voices on Radio 4.
Well, good news, Gail. I'm not sure if Sean Lay is doing any more programmes, but he's doing longer ones, and he will be at the helm of World at One next Friday. But change is not always welcome on Radio 4.
My name's Pam Evans, and I live in Dorset and London. I don't believe the controller of Radio 4 actually does what I do every weekday, i.e. listen to Radio 4 from the early shipping forecast until the repeat of the Woman's Hour serial, or she would never have decided to extend World at One by 50%. I work from home, and by 6:30 in the evening, I've had 15 minutes of news briefing, 3 hours of Today, 30 minutes of World at One, 1 hour of PM, and 30 minutes of the 6 o'clock news. Why doesn't Radio 4 scrap World at One completely and have from our own correspondent every day instead?
Hello, I'm Robert Clark and I live in North Lambeth in London. I've got the following questions. What programmes have been cut either to make way for the 1:30 changes or make space in the afternoon for the programmes that have been moved? My second question is, where will the programmes that have been moved from the 1:30 slot appear in the schedule? And finally, what are the long-term plans for the 13:45 slot?
I learned to my horror of the plan to change the time of feedback on Fridays. For more years than I care to name, your subtle blend of features and insightful interviews has kept me buoyed up during the last throes of Friday's monster house clean. By the time you start broadcasting, blood sugars are dangerously low and the prospect of lunch is still some time off. Feedback gets me through these final treacherous minutes. Sadly, I cannot promise to follow you to your new slot. By that time, I shall be en route to the shops.
Anne Casement. May I suggest internet shopping, or perhaps our podcast? Whatever, Anne no doubt is one of very many whose personal schedules are being disrupted by the changes. Tony Pilgrim is Radio 4's scheduling head. Is he mad or a visionary? Either way, does he know what he's let himself in for? And is he doing it for the money?
No, the decision to extend the World at One was editorially driven. It was ultimately the decision of Gwyneth Williams, the controller, and I think she's spoken to you about that decision before, and we'll probably come back to talk about it some more.
And how about savings? Will these changes save money?
Overall, no, there's no net saving, but the decisions that we took about what needs to give way in order to get the extension into the schedule had to take into account how are we going to make the money balance out, as well as how are we going to make the timings work.
That sounds to me another way of saying you will save money, or at least you won't spend any more money.
We won't spend any more money.
Can you tell us who's listening then at 1 o'clock, and when does the audience start to fall away?
There is some fall away after 1:30 because people have heard the news, and the people who have come in for their lunchtime opportunity might be moving back into whatever they're doing in the afternoon. But the audience holds fairly well right through the Archers and the afternoon play. There is a dipping off between 3 and 4. It's undeniable. And then things start to pick up again from 4 o'clock. In the afternoons, we do skew slightly more female at the moment, the people that are listening. And they are slightly older than the average audience on Radio 4.
And the average audience is what, 53, 54-ish?
55.
So in deciding to extend the World at One from 1 to 1:45, that meant you had to move some half-hour programmes, including feedback. But you also had to commission a number of 15-minute programmes. Listener Robert Clark wants to know, what long-term plans are there for that slot? What's coming up in these 15 minutes?
We have a narrative history of the post office coming later in the year. And we have a history of sport that's running for a number of weeks next year in the Olympic year, and this will enable us to get these really highly appreciated series to a much higher audience. This is one of the real positives we hope that people will find from this reschedule.
Now, you don't do this lightly, do you? Because anybody in your position knows that the immediate reaction of a significant part of the Radio 4 audience is, don't do it. Will you review these changes, and when will you do so?
Absolutely, we will, yeah. We're trying to move things into places where we think that that the existing audience will still be able to find it, and that actually some of the new audience that we know to be out there who are not listening between 3 and 5 at the moment and are listening to other radio services inside and outside the BBC, we think that they will be attracted to the things that we are moving. But you're absolutely right. There will be people for whom this is unsettling whenever we change things. We have had some feedback, though, that some people are looking forward to the extended news programme, and that some people are actually quite keen to find the programmes they weren't able to find at 1:30 before, because they're moving to a slot that works for their lifestyle.
Tony Pilgrim, and you can find more details about these changes on the Radio 4 blog, so please let me know what you think. Just before the end of our final lunchtime edition of Feedback, I returned to my interview last week with Claire McGinn, the editor of Any Questions and Any Answers. Of course, I had to raise the Jonathan Dimbleby question, as so many of you regularly contact me about the chairman's presenting, and some say interviewing, style. And this week was no exception.
I'm Trevor Eaton, and I think he is absolutely superb when he's dealing with Any Answers. I think the respect with which he treats ordinary people, he's very, very polite and nice to all the people, particularly the people who are a little bit nervous.
So, Any Answers is great, but Trevor thinks Jonathan interrupts a little too much on Any Questions and needs to be regulated. So, he's come up with a formula.
You work out a reasonable quotient on the basis of the ratio of the amount of time that Dimbleby speaks as opposed to the time that the panellists speak. You take into consideration reasonable interruptions. Sometimes he does interrupt quite legitimately, and then you can guide it in the right direction, I think.
So that's JD over AQ times 5 panellists divided by 50 minutes, repeated on Saturday lunchtime. Got it. Please remember to switch on for feedback at 4:30 p.m. next Friday, November the 11th. Our repeat is still at 8 p.m. on Sundays. Any questions? In the broadcasting calendar, attracting 600 delegates and around 100 high-profile speakers, including Melvyn Bragg, Victoria Derbyshire, and the Director-General of the BBC, Mark Thompson himself. In fact, anyone was there, darling, except for you, the listener. A bit of an oversight, I thought, so I took a couple of listeners along with me to let the movers and shakers know what the audience thinks. As you might have guessed, the future of local radio was high on the agenda. A few weeks ago, the BBC proposed that its local radio stations in England take what amounts to a 12% cut in their budgets and share more programmes between neighbouring stations. Alan Lynn thinks some of us are more equal than others in the BBC.
Having read about the cuts that are being threatened to Radio Cumbria, and then on the same day,
here for from the early shipping forecast until the repeat of the Woman's Hour serial, or she would never have decided to extend World at One by 50%. I work from home, and by 6:30 in the evening, I've had 15 minutes of news briefing, 3 hours of Today, 30 minutes of World at One, 1 hour
Just one of a
PM,
number of feedback listeners who is not looking forward to the new afternoon lineup. But first we head north, to where the sun always shines, the blue sky is reflected in the crystal clear waters, and the rowers skim up and down the canals. I am, of course, talking about Salford, to where every London-based BBC producer and executive is desperate to move, and where this year's Radio Festival has just been held.
Radio Festival Radio.
This is Radio Festival Radio.
From the Radio Festival 2011 at the Lowry, Salford Quays.
The independently run festival is one of the biggest events.
That Andrew Marr and his team were jollying off to Australia to broadcast the start of the week from Perth. I thought that the BBC had rather got its priorities wrong.
This is Philip Edwards from Northwich in Cheshire.
almost 44% of the BBC's entire budget is allocated to BBC One television. By comparison, the whole of BBC local radio receives just 4.6% of the total budget, and radio in its entirety just 19%.
John Phipps, also from Cumbria, has identified another area of the BBC where he thinks fat could be trimmed first. During a recent visit to the area by Radio 1's Chris Moyle's show, John said he was amazed by the size of the team which travelled with the breakfast show presenter. But back to the Radio Festival in Salford and a debate entitled The Death of Local. This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. It's not only St Paul's Cathedral in London which has demonstrators at its gates. 1 mile or so to the west in Portland Place, another venerable institution has been under siege.
Cut the bonuses at boardroom level, cut the celebrity rubbish, and give us local radio.
Protest outside Broadcasting House in support of BBC London and other local radio stations and against the planned cuts in their programmes and jobs. And do you need more news at lunchtime? You're going to get it.
I don't believe the controller of Radio 4 actually does what I do every weekday. I listen to radio.
Hosted by 5 Live's Sam Walker, and in which various speakers, including David Holdsworth, the controller of BBC English Regions, talked about the impact of the cuts. We got our hands on a feedback Access All Areas pass for BBC Radio Shropshire listener Andy Boddington and took him along.
I want to find out what's happened to local radio. I was rung yesterday by an 88-year-old listener in Shropshire who said she was totally bereft. And she said, go and tell them not to cut it and go and find out why they're cutting it. There's much more they could cut.
Well, I hope we'll find out why in a few minutes. Let's go in.
At the sort of value per listener. In England, £2.83 per listener is what the value of local radio is. In Scotland, £7.37, Wales £10.95, Northern Ireland £11.93 per listener is the budget out there. How's that fair on the listeners to